So good morning, everybody. Very welcome to this last day sessions of this conference. If you can please take your seats. So this is a session on surveillance and control from modeling to stakeholder analysis. Will be chaired by Wopke van der Werf. Wopke is a professor at the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands and is also a member of the EFSA Plant Health Panel. So have a good session. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Very welcome. We will start right away to keep on time. The first speaker is Alexander Mastin, and he's talking on developing surveillance strategies for Xylella fastidiosa in the Mediterranean region. The floor is yours. Yes. And enjoy.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thanks to all of you for coming in so early to listen to my talk. I'd like to thank the organisers as well for giving me the opportunity to present some of this work. My name is Alex Mastin. I work with Stephen Parnell at the University of Salford. And today I'm going to talk about developing surveillance strategies for Xylella. And this is some work I've done as part of the XF Actors project, in particular with Stephen White and Dan Chapman at the CEH. Okay. So I'll start by explaining the context of my study in terms of surveillance in Apulia in Italy, and then I'll go on to describe why and how we can go about optimising these kind of surveillance strategies. I'll then share the preliminary results of some surveillance optimisation I've conducted for Apulia and explain where we're planning on going next. So let's start by looking at Xylella surveillance in Apulia, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. But here's Apulia. With this red zone here showing the extent, the kind of current extent of Xylella spread currently. Eradication from Apulia is no longer considered possible, so the focus now is on preventing further spread out of this red infected zone. And one important component of this is through the use of surveillance activities in order to detect any new incursions beyond that infected zone. And planning out this surveillance is key to its success, and this is the main focus of mine and Stephen's work within the XF Actors project. As I'm sure a lot of you know, a large amount of surveillance has been conducted within this containment zone, which comprises this blue 10-kilometre buffer zone, which sits just adjacent to the infected zone, and then the adjacent 20 kilometres of the infected zone itself. However, we should also consider where to conduct surveillance in the remainder of this green uninfected zone. So for this study, Stephen and I considered the question of where should we conduct surveillance in this uninfected zone, accounting for both the biology of the pathogen, so the primary spread, both from the infected zone, and then further secondary spread from tree to tree within the uninfected zone. So now we have a question, we can move on to looking into actual planning of surveillance. So as I mentioned, surveillance strategies are needed to detect further spread beyond the infected zone, beyond the buffer zone, so that we can implement appropriate control measures. And Stephen and my previous work has shown that we need to account for the biology of the pathogen when we're planning these surveillance strategies. So how do we add biological realism to surveillance planning? We did it using a simulation model, which Stephen and Dan developed as part of the XF Factors project as well, which is a grid-based stochastic model of Xylella spread in Apulia. I won't describe it now in detail because Stephen's going to present it at the next talk. But it basically comprises two deterministic components, which are the growth in the incidence within infected grid cells and local spread from those infected grid cells at a fairly local scale. And then a stochastic component, which relates to longer distance jumps. And these longer distance jumps are presumed to be associated with human-mediated spread, maybe kind of wind-blown insects and things like that. And therefore, it's very difficult to parameterize these. And I'll explain this issue in a couple of slides. So to run the model, we used a gridded distribution of olive trees in Apulia, as we see in this map, with higher densities of olive trees shown in green. And we used the gridded distribution of reported cases of quick decline syndrome in 2016, which is shown here in red, and as you can see, they're down in that infected zone. Now, as I mentioned before, because of the difficulties in parameterizing this long-distance spread, which is going to be key to any pathogen entry into the uninfected zone, I considered two possible forms of this. The first of these was based directly on Stephen and Dan's model, and this assumed a Gaussian dispersal function. So this means that spread is most common fairly near to infected sites, and there's little long-distance spread. I also considered the other extreme, which is basically random spread to anywhere in Apulia from the infected zone. So I'm effectively assuming a uniform dispersal kernel here. I ran each of these models for 10,000 realizations, and these maps here show the average predictions of the incidence for the two scenarios after 1 year, so in 2017, and here's in the subsequent year in 2018. So you can see the hotspots down in the infected zone look fairly similar, but there is actually quite a considerable difference in the pattern within the uninfected zone, with more spread close to the border of the infected zone with the default parameters, with the restricted spread, but more generalized spread throughout the uninfected zone when we look at the longer distance spread. In fact, when we look at locations reached by the pathogen in at least one of the 10,000 model realizations I looked at, which I show here in purple, we can really clearly see the constraints that Gaussian kernel places on the distribution. So no realizations had any spread up higher in Apulia here in this model, but in the other more long-range spread model, we can see we have quite a lot of spread, and it spreads to every single grid cell at least once and at least one realization. Okay. So our next step is to think about how we optimize surveillance. The first thing we need to consider are the actual aims of surveillance, and there's many possible aims of surveillance. So whenever we're planning any surveillance activities, we need to really clearly, explicitly state what our aim is. In our case, we want our surveillance strategy to minimize the probability that we fail to detect infection in that uninfected zone. And this is useful because we can use the output of our model to easily calculate this probability for any combination of n selected grid cells, if we're selecting within our uninfected zone, given we know how many trees we're sampling from each. And that's shown here in this equation. So Pn here is our incidence within any particular grid cell. So 1 minus Pn can be considered to be the probability of not selecting an infected tree if we were to take a single sample from that cell. And we can scale this up if we're assuming we're taking X samples from a single site by multiplying that probability with itself an appropriate number of times. And this gives us an estimate of the probability of not selecting any infected trees from that cell, given a sampling effort of X. And we can then calculate the probability of not selecting any infected trees in any of our n visited sites by just simply multiplying these probabilities together for all those n sites. Now, we also wanted to account for the secondary spread within the uninfected zone, and this is a particular feature of the Cadiro strain of Xylella, so that we can target surveillance towards potential higher risk clusters, more at risk of spreading there. So we capture this by using 2 consecutive years of output in our model function. And we can very simply account for that by just multiplying the probabilities for each year together to get the probability of not selecting any infected trees in either of those 2 years. Okay, so to recap, for any set of n sites, we can estimate the probability of failing to detect infection for a particular pattern of surveillance. What we need now is a way of finding the combination of n sites which minimizes this probability. So we're minimizing the probability that we miss infection. However, the number of possible combinations of sites is far too great to evaluate all of them. So we need to use algorithmic optimization routines to identify this best combination. In our case, we use a process called simulated annealing. For those of you not familiar with simulated annealing, our approach works by we first select a random batch of n locations, and we assess the probability that we fail to detect infection given we've selected those points. And we then change one single location for another location, again randomly selected, and reassess that probability again. Now, we can either keep the old point or keep the new point. First, early on in the process, we make it quite likely we'll accept worse locations. So these are locations which actually result in an increase in the probability of not detecting infection. But we repeat the process again and again over thousands of iterations. And as we do so, we gradually reduce the probability that we will accept these worse locations. So this shows a bit of the output of the probability of no detection here on the y-axis, and then the iteration of the algorithm. Like I said, we run it thousands and thousands of times. And in the initial stage, we can see that the probability of no detection jumps up and down. We're not really optimizing anything here. We're basically exploring the parameter space. But after a while, we start to increasingly reject selections which increase that probability of no detection. So we reject worse selections. That leads to a decrease in our overall probability of no detection until we reach a point where we're only selecting points which minimize that probability. And this arrangement of points, although it may not be the exact optimal arrangement, it should approach this optimal arrangement of points. Okay, so to recap, we used simulated annealing to identify which locations should be sampled in order to minimize the probability that we fail to detect infection in that uninfected zone. We assumed that we're sampling an average of 1 tree per hectare, so that's about 100 trees per kilometre square grid cell, and we repeated this approach for a different number of sample locations from 50 up to 500. Okay, so I'll now quickly go through the results of applying this method in Apulia. I should point out these are preliminary results, and it's more an exploration of the impact of this long-distance spread dispersal function than anything else. So we can see here are our traces from our optimization. On the left, we've got under the default parameters with that restricted spread, and on the right here where we've got the more long-range spread, and it's repeating for each different number of locations. As you'd expect, as you're sampling more locations, our overall probability of no detection decreases further and further. And this slide shows the distribution of the optimal sampling locations for each model overlaid on the maps of the average incidence within that uninfected zone and within each grid cell. So here on the left, we have the optimal locations, and they're quite difficult to see. So it's basically here on the left for 50 sites. All the selected sites are down in this region and in this region. And then if we increase that up to 500 sites, we can see it's just further clustering here, very close to the buffer zone which lies here. On the right, we see the results for the longer range spread, and the yellow dots are distributed throughout the whole site. We can see it a little bit more clearly when we've got 500 sites compared to 50 sites. They're generally clustering around these areas of higher olive tree density, which is partly a result of our model, which assumed that transmission only occurred from olive trees. Now, rather than showing you lots of different graphs, I'll demonstrate our approach using these plots here. So these show the probability that we fail to detect infection on the y-axis for different numbers of sites visited. As I said, I evaluated things for anything from 50 sites up to 500 sites. Now, these particular lines here show the effect if we were to just randomly sample throughout that whole uninfected zone. Now, obviously, random sampling comes with it variation. So to account for that, I repeated the random sampling approach 1,000 times and took the average, shown here in the middle, with the dashed line, and then looked at the minimum and the maximum probabilities of no detection, shown here in the dotted lines. This red line at the bottom basically shows our the best possible approach if we were to sample every single site in the uninfected zone. So that's the best we can possibly do. And as you'd expect, as we increase our number of samples in both cases, we reduce the probability that we fail to detect infection. This effect is probably more pronounced when we have the longer range spread and therefore the kind of wider distribution of spread from that infected zone. Now we can add in the results of our actual optimization. So here's the results of the optimization using the shorter range spread, the default parameters from Stephen's model. As you can see, again, we have a clear trend of a decreasing probability of missing infection as we increase that number of sites. In both cases, and we see in the case of the shorter distance spread, because we have that clustering just adjacent to the buffer zone, we can actually approach the best possible arrangement of locations, and that's optimal, minimise that probability of missing infection there. For the longer range spread, we don't reach our best possible line, but we can see a very clear improvement as we increase that number of sites. And in both cases, we can very clearly see that these optimal selections outperform just random sampling throughout the uninfected zone. So this shows that we can use these optimization routines to better target surveillance efforts, given we know the pattern of this spread, the long-distance spread. Okay, so I'll now look at how this compares with the current strategy in Apulia and discuss our next steps. So this map on the left shows the current surveillance activities in 2017 within the uninfected zone. And in particular, what we're interested in is this yellow region here, which is just adjacent to the buffer zone and shows all the sites visited in the uninfected zone. And we can very clearly see that these compare very well with the optimal locations in that restricted spread model. So if we're assuming that most spread is fairly short distance and we don't get very long distance jumps, then this would be very close to the optimal pattern of surveillance that we would need in that uninfected zone. With the main difference being in this area of low olive density, which isn't selected for in the optimization, but has been visited in the case of the real data. However, if we look at the pattern for the unrestricted spread model, the uniform spread model, we have a very different pattern. So again, we can see it's distributed throughout the whole uninfected zone, as I mentioned before, with some kind of concentration in these high olive tree areas. But that obviously is very different from the actual pattern. So this demonstrates the importance of evaluating this long-distance spread further when we're planning and when we're optimizing surveillance. So, to summarize, simulation models of Xylella can be used to identify where best to conduct surveillance in the uninfected zone of Apulia. And the best way to conduct surveillance depends on the nature of this pathogen spread from the infected zone. And it may not always be the case that we concentrate our efforts close to that boundary. We need to really work on improving our understanding of those long-range spread patterns. So characterising the long-distance spread is going to be crucial, and this is now the main focus of our work with Stephen and Dan from the CIHEAM to improve on these findings, and so we can better optimise surveillance. So I'd like to thank my collaborators within the XF Actors project who fund this work, in particular Stephen Parnell at Salford and Stephen and Dan at the CIHEAM. And thank all of you for listening.
Thanks very much. Please come forward. Don't be afraid to step in. Our next speaker is going to start anyhow, Stephen White. He's from the Centre of Ecology and Hydrology near Oxford in the United Kingdom. The floor is yours, Stephen.
I'll just wait for everybody to come in.
Stephen is very polite. He waits for people to come down, so please come down quickly. Quickly. Okay. I have to keep the time.
You might miss something if you're not sat down. Okay, maybe I should start. So thanks for coming, everybody. I'm going to present some modelling work. I'm not going to present all the details. I'll save a lot of the equations. But if you have any questions, please feel free to get hold of me on whatever media you'd like. So we started this work some time ago. We were invited by our friends at EFSA to start modelling the spread of Xylella in Apulia. And This is how we sort of got started on the project. So what we want to do is try and create models which will try to predict how Xylella is spreading throughout this Italian region. And so if we can do that, then we can perhaps inform control policies and we can guide surveillance. So this is what the model looks like. Apologies if you don't read maths. So this is quite a simple model. So when we started, it was a few years ago, we didn't have a lot of information. It's a very new outbreak. And so we thought the best option is to go for the simplest model as we can. This model has three components to it, really, which is this olive map. So we took presence-absence data where olives are in Apulia, and then re-rasterized that and made that into an olive cover map at a 1 kilometre resolution. So that's presented in this graph up here. Within each cell, within each grid point, each kilometre square, we wanted a model to show how disease progresses, so growth, in other words, within that cell. So we have a local population model, which is given by this. So it's a recursive equation based on a yearly time step. And we have some idea of what a carrying capacity is. So in other words, the maximum infection in that grid cell, which is 100%. And so it's a function of the olive cover and other host plants. Okay, so this is kind of what Samuel Subaran was talking about this sort of hidden compartment. So we've got this in our model as well. And then on top of that, we have disease spread. So we want to know how we've got our gridded landscape, and we want to know how disease moves around that landscape. So we have two components. So this is called stratified dispersal, where we have local movement, so between grid cells, and we also have this longer range, the stochastic dispersal, where things can move a long distance. So we're trying to sort of have a model the process of bugs, vectors, moving locally within the landscape, and also maybe hitchhiking on cars and moving a long distance. And then you can put it all together in some sort of mathematical model, which I won't explain. So we did this, and we get a model that looks something like this. So we have the outbreak, which we think happened somewhere near Gallipoli. And what you see is this local build-up of infection, and then these longer-range dispersal starts to take into account. So I'd just like to point out that this is a stochastic model. Okay, so if you're from this region and your town starts to become infected, it doesn't mean we're predicting that your town will become infected. It's stochastic. The movement around the landscape is random, which is what we think is happening according to the data. So it will change with every model simulation. And so we've written up this model, which you can download from Biological Invasion's website. So we can use this model now to have some idea of what the risk is across the landscape. Okay, so we can do lots of model simulations. As I said, it's stochastic and take some sort of average and work out what the risk to particular locations may be over a particular time frame. And so what we've done here, we've calculated the risks of the colour map across the peninsula, and we've compared that to the positive location as lab-confirmed Xylella outbreaks, and you can do some statistics and show that the model has does pretty well and closely correlates with infection data. Okay. So we have a model. If I convinced you that it's doing a good job at predicting spread, we can try to use it. Okay, so as we all know, there's this buffer zone across the peninsula. This is an old picture; it's now changed. But what they're doing in the buffer zone is hopefully removing infected plants and removing vectors. So we can use the model to actually guide that strategy. Okay, so big questions should be, will the buffer zone stop the spread of Xylella? Okay, that's our ultimate goal. We want to stop it moving northward. And then also, how wide should the buffer zone be? We're talking about tearing up trees. We want to be as wide as possible to stop infection, but not wider. So can we use the model to answer those questions? Well, yes, we can, because I put it up on the slide. So we can vary the width of the buffer and then map how, or calculate what the change in risk beyond the buffer could be. And what you see is you increase the buffer width, so you go down the colours, you get a decrease in risk, is what you expect. What we do notice is the risk doesn't go to zero. Okay? So it's likely that, according to the model at least, that the risk won't go to zero, meaning that we won't stop infection. And this is largely to do with the long-distance dispersal, which I'll come back to in a moment. We can also look at detection, so surveillance within the buffer zone, and have some sort of notion of intensity of surveillance, so whether you have perfect surveillance, so at 100% surveillance, so we're very good within that buffer zone, or we can reduce that intensity of surveillance within the buffer zone. And you can map how that changes the risk using a given buffer. Okay? And what you see within the buffer zone is you get a change in risk, but beyond the buffer zone, so beyond that edge of the buffer zone, you can see how the risk changes. So again, it doesn't change, doesn't go to zero. So I apologise, this graph is kind of complicated. So we start to think, well, okay, so let's assume you've got a limited budget. Okay, so the EU does not have an infinite budget, which is a shame, but how can we optimise the buffer strategy? Okay, so what's better? Should we increase the buffer zone width, so we have a very wide buffer, or should we increase the surveillance within the buffer zone itself? Okay, so we can do that, we can model that. And so what I've done here, so the colours are mean risk. On the y-axis, we have the buffer width, and this is efficiency within sort of searching intensity within of surveillance. And as you see, as you vary this, you get different changes in risk. The black lines are your budget. So these are lines of equal budget. So for a particular line, if you follow it down as equal budget, we can find where you minimise risk. Okay, so this is what you want, things that are the most blue along this line. As you can see, you get an optimal trade-off between surveillance and width of buffer to minimise risk. And you can do this for different amounts of budget. And what you see is you get if you join the dots, you get a curve in optimal strategies. And what this is saying is that as you increase the amount of budget you spend on controlling within the buffer, then you should actually start to increase the buffer width and not so much pay so much effort on surveillance within the buffer. So it's better to control the buffer zone width. Okay, so that was our initial model, and it's a very simple model, but we know that there are things wrong with it. So I'll let you into a little modelling secret in that all models are wrong, okay? But there's an old adage that some models are useful, okay? And the way you make them more useful is to put more biology into them, make them more relevant, okay? And this is where we partner with various collaborators through XF Factors and Ponti to try and build more biological realism into the model. As I said, it's a very simple model. So rather than having very simple representation of olive dynamics with bacterium growth and dispersal, we should start to think about all the other parts of biology that are important. So let's try to think about a few of those things. So as you know, as Juan Namas pointed out, there's some plots, some surveillance plots going on right now in Apulia, where we're monitoring things like disease incidence and severity over time. Okay? And we can use this data to try to improve the growth model, so fit them closely with data. So this work is very much still ongoing, and we're trying to better understand these disease progression growth curves. And as my question yesterday to Juan Namas points out, I think we still have some way to go to try to improve how our understanding of how disease progresses at a very local scale. So the other big interest that we have is vector seasonality. So vectors play a big a big part of our understanding of the epidemiology of Xylella in Apulia. And this has been a common theme throughout all of the talks that we've had over the last couple of days. So one of the big questions we would like to ask is, how does vector seasonality affect disease dynamics? So as you saw yesterday, Juan Navas put this slide up showing disease severity over time. Okay, and what you see are these are different plots, and you see some sort of change in disease severity over time. And it's very seductive graph. I think it's very seductive in that there's some sort of change, and there's this little kick in the tail here, which may be some indication of there's some sort of seasonality to disease severity. And as we know, as Ben Moose's poster has shown in paper, there is some sort of seasonal dynamics in the vectors. And so what I did very simply was to create a model, and this is a simple infection model, and plotted disease over time and over various years, and you can get these sort of graphs out. But when I use Ben Moose's data to modify a simple cosine wave into a vector sort of parameterization, you get very different disease progression graphs. So it could show that there's some very important dynamics going on here. So I think we need to better understand this. As Alex kindly pointed out, dispersal is a big thing. So our understanding of long-distance dispersal is key to predicting where diseases go and whether we can contain it. Okay, so what we're trying to do now is use the infection data over the map to try and understand the relationship between dispersal probability, so where new infections occur, and distance. And so we can fit statistical models to this data to try to tease apart our understanding of how this might work. And what we've shown so far is that the positives are that you predict the next wave of infection sites based on the previous year. So this gives credence to the idea that this is secondary infection, and this idea that's been visited before. And our assumption here is that, our hypothesis is that road travel by the vectors, so human dispersal, is an important aspect of the dispersal of Xylella. And so this is a feature of this modelling effort, and we can say it's very preliminary analysis, but we have some indication that road networks play a part in the dispersal of vectors and Xylella. And so all of this work, I hope, is shown you that we need to improve these models, and here are some of the things that we actually need to be able to parameterize these models a lot better. And I'd like to encourage you to get in contact so that we can talk about these sorts of things some more. So thank you. I'd just like to thank all of our collaborators, EFSA, etc. And if you'd like to know more, please do get in contact. And I think I'll stop talking there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Time. Thanks very much, Stephen. Next speaker is Pieter Beck from the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission. And he'll be speaking about evaluating containment options for a Xylella outbreak in Andalusia through network analysis.
Good morning. So I'll be presenting work that we're doing at JRC, led by Giovanni Strona, and in collaboration with Claudio Castellano and Luigi Ponti, who are not here. As Stephen pointed out, pest spread models can forecast outbreaks, but we need lots of data to parameterize them wisely, either to calibrate them or to build them up from the biological understanding we have of the entire system. That includes data on hosts, on vectors, and on pathogens. I think it's clear from the discussion in the previous days that in this sense, Xylella is a complex system. We have multiple hosts, we have multiple vectors, and we have a bacterial pathogen. But it can work. When the system is slightly simpler, there's good evidence that models that simulate the biological processes based on our biological understanding, not on the observed spread, can simulate plant disease epidemics. This is work that we're doing on pinewood nematode. The cartoon at the bottom shows the history of the pinewood nematode spread in Portugal. And with Begoña de la Fuente, we calibrated the model purely on literature values that require the kind of data that the earlier speaker also mentioned on dispersal abilities of the vector, on distribution of hosts, on host density if you're working on a unit area, those kind of things. But when you have them, then those models work. Here you see outlined in black, in 2 different years, the observed spread as reported by the Portuguese authorities, and in red, what this model predicts, without any calibration, simply by initiating the model in the location in Portugal where this disease was first observed. If we let that model run for 12 years, we are getting the picture on the right. We're doing a very good job at predicting the observed spread, again, without any model calibration. But that takes time. It takes time to do the research. It takes time also to have the epidemic progress so far that you can actually tell how well you're doing with that model. So when we started working on Xylella, there was no such data, and it was early days of the epidemic. So we took a different approach. And that's where we resorted to complex network analysis. We took the little information we had at that time, which was, among others, that Xylella affects olives. And here in this cartoon on the left, every dot you see is an olive orchard in Puglia, because that we did have data on. And every line is connecting 2 orchards that are within 500 meters from each other, which is what we assume to be a reasonable distance that Philaenus pulmaris could cover in its lifetime. You get a network like this. It looks like a circle because it's not spatial anymore, but it allows you to investigate on very basic epidemiological knowledge what the landscape and the topology of that network offers in terms of possibilities to break the network up, which is actually what we try to do with buffer zones, to identify areas that might act as hubs in the epidemic and that might be targeted for control measures, or whether there are no evident hubs in the network, or whether there are areas that are quite isolated naturally and that could be more easily cordoned off than others. In Puglia, the network, with the data we have, consists of about 60,000 nodes, which in this case is equivalent to an olive orchard, and those connectors in network speak would be called edges. And we showed that Xylella has more than 1 million infection pathways through the olive landscape of Puglia. That analysis also showed that because the network of olive orchards in Puglia is so dense, and even with a relatively conservative estimate of Philaenus pulmaris being able to connect orchards, when infected or not, within 500 meters, that network and the orchards in Puglia all can contribute heavily to the epidemic as we are seeing happening now, as the cartoon on the right shows, which is the history of the records by the Puglia region in terms of monitoring. You see through time on the right, in yellow, the older samples, in red at each stage in time, the new samples, and then in green, the buffer zone as it has been adjusted to those findings. If we look at our findings from published earlier this year, we see that naturally the landscape, the olive landscape, only in the north of Puglia starts to offer possibilities to really find areas where the topology of the olive landscape allows us to more easily cordon off certain areas than other ones, which highlights also the difficulty of initially eradicating and now containing Xylella in Puglia. So now we're moving on to slightly different questions, and we're doing so in Andalusia, where we don't have, as far as we know, Xylella yet, which is similar to Apulia in the sense that you have a very homogeneous cover of olive orchards. Here on the right, you see between 0 and 100% how much of the olive orchard network in Andalusia you can connect if you just draw lines between orchards at a certain distance. So if you draw lines between all the orchards within 1,000 meters from each other, then you can reach almost 100% of the orchards. If a vector can cover only 500 meters, if you land it in a random place, can reach 60% of the orchards in Andalusia. So in that sense, it is similar to Apulia. And we're using now this network to address another question, which actually is a natural segue, I think, of the earlier talks. We're asking how increased long-distance dispersal can change the efficacy of quarantine in a simulated Xylella impact. So I'm going to break down this question to show you how we address the different components of it. So, a simulated Xylella epidemic. I'm going to use this cartoon because we can't draw the network of more than 2 million olive orchards that we're actually analyzing in Andalusia. We're using an SIR model, which is quite simply taking an orchard or a node as infected, allowing it with a certain probability to try and infect its neighbors, which the infected ones then turn red, the green ones are still safe. In our model, each node only gets one opportunity to infect its neighbor, which is very conservative because we know that's not reality. Then that old orchard gets removed from the network, turns gray here, and the epidemic continues. With some probability, there's further diffusion of the epidemic. The infected ones go out in the next round, and this is how it continues with certain probabilities. You'll notice that it is not deterministic. You won't see a green neighbor always turn red because of infection, because it's a stochastic process. But this is how we simulate the epidemic, but in the network of Andalusia for our exercise. Okay. And here you actually see that in this setting, the epidemic dies out by itself, because in the end you have few orchards left, and there's low probability of infection, and it dies out. Okay, so we're running this on the more than 2 million olive orchards in Andalusia, but I'll keep using the cartoon to explain how we're doing it. So we're determining which olive orchards are connected, not on a simple threshold like we did earlier, but we actually have a dispersal, a kernel approach where within 100 meters, 80% or orchards within 100 meters of each other have 80% of being linked in our network, and that decreases exponentially. So that's, again, quite a conservative approach. Then to determine in our simulation what is actually the probability of an infected node passing on the infection to its neighbor within the network, we take a transmission probability that we can vary because we don't know what it is, so we can run very conservative estimates to rather less conservative ones, and we multiply that with habitat suitability for each node, which we are mapping from an earlier work by Gutierrez and Ponti, which is a temperature-based estimate of habitat suitability for Xylella. Does increased long-distance dispersal change the efficacy of quarantine? What does quarantine mean for this talk? Quite simply, we consider any measures that stop an epidemic by removing the nodes neighboring infected ones. So in practical terms, this is perfectly implemented quarantine measures. In the cartoon, that means that when you have an infected node, you identify its neighbors in the network, and you take them out, or you treat them, or whatever it takes to stop that epidemic from passing on. We then imagine it didn't happen, we let the epidemic go a step further, and again we measure what would it take to quarantine this. We are keeping track of how many nodes do you have to quarantine, and how many nodes are you saving if you do so. Yeah? So I'm going to skip through this one, because basically at every step in the epidemic, we're evaluating what is the effort required to quarantine, and how much are you saving in the network. So, all the way through. So then, this is exactly the same information, but we've just added here the bars on the right that keep track of all those nodes. At each stage, when you quarantine, how many do you need to quarantine? How many have you already lost to the epidemic? And how many are you saving? You'll notice in this simple animation, as you implement the quarantine later in the epidemic, of course you have an opportunity to save fewer nodes, because there's fewer uninfected ones, because more have already been removed. If you implement it early in the epidemic, of course you're still saving lots of nodes at a relatively low cost. Here are just 3 random points in the epidemic. If you apply, in our cartoon, at the very early stage, you're saving 88% of your nodes, of your olive orchards, and you've lost 4%, which is a single one. Later on, you're saving 48%, you've lost 36%, and so on. So we can keep track of these numbers as the epidemic progresses. So here we have the saved ones in percentage on the y-axis. Initially, they're all saved. And then you have the lost ones on the x-axis. The epidemic might die out, but this way of representing it gives us the integral under this graph gives us an integrated view of what is the quarantine efficacy. For this particular network, with this particular transmission probability and this topology, how much can you gain by quarantining? How much can you save if you implement it perfectly for this particular network? Our next exercise is then to change up the network and say, what if in the network there is more or less long-distance dispersal? How does that change your opportunity to save nodes by implementing quarantine? So this cartoon just illustrates how we implement that. We take our initial network and we swap out an existing edge, an existing connector, with a long one that we randomly put across the landscape. So imagine this being the accidental transport of infected material from one end of Andalusia to the other end. Yeah? And then we do the same calculations I showed earlier of saying if at any time during the infection we implement quarantine, how much are we actually saving? And how does that change if we implement more or less long-distance dispersal? And how does that change if the infection probability is higher or lower? So, same cartoon again, just to illustrate the point I made. No long-distance dispersal at all, and a network with lots of opportunity for long-distance dispersal. And we let the same level of infection probability run through those two networks. So biologically, they would be similar. And as you can tell, the long-distance dispersal events make your effort and your efficacy of quarantine drop off much quicker. So your ability to save nodes by quarantining at this level of long-distance dispersal is much, much compromised. That's the point I'm making, and I'm now going to make it 3 times. Here,
time's almost up.
Almost up, okay.
30 seconds.
All right. So here, this captures it all in a sense. Here we have the epidemic starting, where all your nodes are still safe, and this is much later in the epidemic. So the different colors here represent scenarios and networks with more or less long-distance dispersal. An early a model without much long-distance dispersal in this setting actually dies out, which we know is not the case for Xylella. As you increase the long-distance dispersal, the efficacy of well-implemented quarantine drops really dramatically. If on top of that you increase the transmission probability, which we don't know very well at this stage, that effect gets exacerbated. So in scenarios of medium to high transmission probability, it takes just a little long-distance dispersal of Xylella for the efficacy of quarantine, the fraction of nodes you can save by quarantining to drop precipitously. I'm going to skip this one because it's again the same thing. So I conclude by saying that we can use networks and the analysis of complex network to improve preparedness in the face of plant health epidemics. It reveals opportunities and challenges in the management of the epidemic also before they occur. We can run them in simulated mode without having to have all the biological information on the system. And under the conservative assumptions we took in the Spanish simulation in terms of vector dispersal ability, early detection, and here the perfect implementation of quarantine, we show that increased long-distance dispersal really drives the epidemic dynamics and determines to what extent quarantine can save a significant fraction of nodes in the landscape. Thank you very much.
Please feel free to come down and occupy seats more in this corner. There are many unfilled spots here, and there's a short announcement.
Yep. The announcement is that we will would like to have a picture of the conference. So please, just before the coffee break and after this session that we will finish up on time, we go to the ramp at the entrance of the building, and we will take there the picture of the conference just before the coffee break. Thank you.
Thanks very much. The next speaker is Monique Mourits of Wageningen University, and she will speak about understanding olive growers' intention to participate in Xylella fastidiosa control in Apulia, Italy. The floor is yours, Monique.
Thank you, Wopke. Good morning, everyone. I also would like to acknowledge first the organizing committee for providing this opportunity to present this research, which is focusing on a rather different topic than the topics that has been discussed so far, because it's not on the Xylella bacterium and not on its factors or its host, but it's referring on the olive growers that have to deal with the presence of the bacterium as such. Well, this research has been the result of a master graduate study that was performed by Franco Ferrilli under the supervision of my colleague Sophie Rickebusch of the Environmental System Analysis Group and myself. Okay. Well, in general, a successful control of an epiphytotic, like the occurrence of Xylella in the southern part of Italy, requires full commitment of stakeholders involved to contain and to control it. Well, in general, research primarily aims at improving the epiphytotic management options, thereby neglecting the actual uptake of these measures in the field. Disease control plans as such assumes that the individual growers make their decisions with respect to control based on the same rigorous scientific evaluations. Well, studies have shown that their decisions are such as biased by heuristics, by their own beliefs with respect to the developed measures as such. In that sense, that assumption is not valid. Well, in respect to the control of epiphytotics, the role of farmers' behavior in respect to that management has, until recently, analyzed only poorly. This in contrast to other fields like human health management and animal health management, where insights in farmers' behavior have been included in the development of so-called control plans. Hence, the aim of this research was to evaluate the influence of individual behavior of olive growers with respect to the uptake of control measures that were defined in the southern part of Italy, or more specifically to evaluate the influence of individual behavior with respect to the implementation or the uptake of the measures that were implemented during the summer of 2016 in the region of Lecce, because for some of these measures, implementation appeared to be rather difficult due to a strong opposition from local growers. Well, the theoretical backbone or framework related to this study is related to the so-called theory of plant behavior, which has been introduced by EIGEN in 1991. With respect to behavior, the best precursor of implementing a certain behavior is motivation, or the behavioral intention as such. So, based on this theory, the aim is to assess this level of motivation, because the higher the motivation, the higher the odds that a particular behavior will be applied. And according to this theory, the intention is influenced by three independent psychological variables, knowing attitude, subjective norm, and the so-called perceived behavioral control. Well, attitude has to do with the belief of the individual to the extent that a certain behavior, in this case control measure, is able to produce the expected outcome, as well as his or her perception with the relevancy of that particular outcome. So, for instance, phytosanitary measures focusing on the reduction of the vector population and to what extent it is perceived by the grower that it is really reducing the vector population as such, and the relevancy of that reduction with respect to the containment of the disease. Subjective norm is related to the social pressure that is exercised to apply certain behavior or to apply certain control measures. It indicates to what extent a person, a grower, is sensitive for judgment with respect to control measures by others. So the judgment by, for instance, neighboring growers, family, agricultural organizations, and governmental organizations. Then the perceived behavioral control has to do with the belief of the grower that he or she is able to apply the measure as such. So it has to do with the knowledge, the ability to apply, as well with the availability of resources to apply the indicated control measure. Well, with this theory, it is feasible to evaluate which of these psychological variables are relevant to determine intention, but as such, as policymaker, it's really hard to implement these insights because they are rather abstract. So by relating relevant psychological variables to socio-demographic characteristics, policymakers get quantitative entries that can be applied in the formulation of a control plan, aiming for a higher uptake of the defined measures as such. Well, within this study, intention was measured for those containment measures that were implemented during the summer of 2016, considering of ordinary pruning of non-infected trees as a preventive measure, the extraordinary pruning of infected trees, the uprooting of infected trees and neighboring hosts, and the measures related to the vector population and indicated by the last two on the slides. Well, due to time restriction, I will only focusing on the intention with respect to the implementation of the first three measures as such. Well, face-to-face questionnaires were applied to obtain the required information with respect to, well, the intention levels, the psychological variables, as well as the socio-demographic variables or characteristics. Particular statements were used to measure the intention level as well as the psychological variables by asking growers to rate the statement on a 5-point Likert scale. So, for instance, here's the example given of the statement to assess the intention with respect to pruning as a preventive measure. Well, based on this statement, sorry. Growers indicated whether they agreed, strongly agreed, or disagreed, or strongly disagreed with this statement. Well, besides the intention and psychological variables, socio-demographic characteristics were assessed. Those were related with characteristics of the grower, him or herself, knowing age, education level, household situation, as well as characteristics related to the orchard, the size of it, the density, the presence of varieties, occurrence of the systems of the olive quick decline syndrome, the nearest distance to infected orchards, Well, given this collection of data, the next step was to evaluate the relationship between intention and the psychological variables, and for this purpose, logic regression analysis were performed. The 5-point Likert scale scores were, as such, the lowest were aggregated to reflect the negative score, while the two most positive Likert scores were aggregated to reflect a general positive score with respect to intention, which makes it possible to perform these logic regression analysis. So it was done in 2 steps. First, analyzing the significant relationships between intention and those measured psychological variables, and secondly, given those variables that were significantly relevant, to what extent these were influenced by the measured socio-demographic characteristics. Well, in total, 100 growers were approached to join this survey, distributed among more than 50 municipalities within the Lecce region. 4 of those growers declined to participate in the survey, resulting in 19 specific data entries. Well, given the analysis performed, first looking at the control measures related to ordinary pruning, the preventive measure, in general, the motivation to apply this measure was high. The majority of the growers indicated that they agreed or strongly agreed to apply the measure as such. When we performed the regression on the psychological factors, it turned out that only the perceived behavioral control was relevant, indicating that those growers that believe that they have enough resources to apply this ordinary pruning in a structural way, they intended to be more positive about the intention to apply it as such. Well, the perceived behavior control itself was significantly influenced by the socio-demographic variables related to education level and average income. There was the risk that these variables were related, so for that reason they were tested for the presence of collinearity, which was absent. So as such, these 2 demographic characteristics were significantly related to the belief that the growers had the resources to apply as such. From the questionnaire itself, it cannot be derived what the underlying explanation is with respect to the fact that growers with a university level perceived or had a higher belief that they had the resources available to do so. It can be the fact that they had considered that the beliefs, that the benefits of applying the pruning balance the cost that needs to be made to perform the measure as such. Well, the fact that the higher the income, the higher the belief that the resources are present is a rather obvious explanation as such. With respect to extraordinary pruning, the intention level was also high. 86% of the growers indicated they agreed to apply it when needed. And in this case, attitude was really relevant for a positive intention, for a high intention. So those growers that perceive that the extraordinary pruning is useful to control the disease as such intended to have a higher positive intention to apply the measure as such. With respect to the socioeconomic factors, only average income and the lower income turned to be significant relevant. The other psychological variable that was relevant here was again the availability of resources. If the grower believed that he has the resources in place, he was 2 times more willing to apply the measure as such. This belief was significantly influenced again by education level, the level of income. The higher the income level, the more resources expect to be available. while when the production is related to the agro-tourism activity, we see that there is a negative impact on the belief of the grower that he or she will have the resources available to perform the measure. Possible explanation could be that the extraordinary pruning will affect the image of the orchard, which is actually the attracting element of the tourists in this particular region. Then with respect to uprooting, well, intention was much lower. There were different types of intention asked in relation to uprooting with respect to the compensation. When there was no compensation at all for uprooting the trees, the intention was equal to 30%. With compensation of the trees based on market value, the intention only increased to 37%. Well, these were significantly influenced by the attitude, psychological factors as such. Well, to conclude, because the game is over in that sense, although it was a really small explorative study, I mean, it was about 96 respondents. Well, there are more than 60,000 growers in that region. It indicates that, well, the TPB approach as such is useful in the extent to understand what's happening on farm level with respect to management, because the emphasis is on the actors that need to apply the measures and their evaluation of the disease management as such. It gives insight how, targeted interventions could be designed to foster the uptake of control measures. Yeah. As for instance, in this study, it became aware that overall the intention of control measures were influenced by the attitude of the grower and the perceived behavioral control. Social norm did not influence as such, and that these by themselves were influenced primarily by the socioeconomic variables, education and income, which, well, could indicate that, for instance, information campaigning and centers for low income could be an example of targeted intervention to foster the uptake of the control measures as such. And with this slide, I conclude, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Monique. For the next talk, we have two speakers, so the time control becomes even more exciting. And the first speaker is Maria Rosaria Mannino of the European Food Safety Authority. Second speaker is Jens Linge of the Joint Research Centre. And they will both be speaking on media monitoring using the Medisys platform. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bobke. Good morning. So I am going to present to you with Jens the results from the automated media monitoring on Xylella fastidiosa that we are carrying out using the Medisys platform. Just information about the context of this work. We are carrying out this activity in the context of the Horizon Scanning project in collaboration with GRC, and this is why we have to answer to a question from the Commission, European Commission, that sent us a mandate to work on Horizon Scanning with the media monitoring. So we are screening the media and also scientific literature, and we have been asked also to rank the pests identified thanks to this activity of monitoring. The objective is to identify relevant information pests that can be interesting for Europe. And why we are doing it is because the final objective is to improve the European preparedness in addressing plant health threats. And this objective is perfectly in line with the principle of prevention that is at the basis of the new legislative framework for plant health in Europe. So what we are doing? We are using the Medisys IT platform for media and literature monitoring. We are monitoring 351 pests, but not only because we have some, we have keywords that allow us to find also information on new pests, on emerging pests. We are editing monthly newsletters to the attention of the European Commission and also to the attention of member states representative in the PAF committee that are, who are discussing the results and the content of the newsletter in their monthly meetings. And we also update the EFSA plant health section in Medisys, and you will see in more details with the presentation of Jens. From this page, you can also subscribe to an email alert that you can receive with the frequency that you want to choose, that you choose. Something more about the monthly newsletter that we send to the Commission and Member States. It contains the table of content with cross references. There is a section describing the main issues of the month, so giving information about the pest of concern in the period monitored. There are links to the articles on internet. There are translation and also the sources and the dates of publication of the articles. And we had 8 editions from March this year till October. About Xylella fastidiosa. Xylella fastidiosa was one of the main issues in the newsletter. I was sometimes surprised by the news found on Xylella on media. In the 8 editions of the newsletter, we selected in total 175 articles, but from a pool of more than 3,000 articles found between March and October this year. The main issues in 2017 for Xylella, of course, the progression of the disease in Italy, Spain, and in France. Not only the progression, also, for example, information about the finding of new host plants. Starting in June this year, we found a lot of articles about the new outbreaks in the mainland Spain, in Alicante. Another topic covered by media is the difficulty to put in place the mandatory control measures, difficulties for farmers, in particular, for example, the removing of healthy plants in the limited zone, in infected zone. And another topic really important was, still is, the funding for owners of affected groves. So they are, of course, waiting for help to put in place the measures. and from both national organization and European organization. Another topic very important, covered by media, is the result from science, from research, for example, concerning the possibility of planting resistant or tolerant varieties. And at the end, in the last editions of the newsletter, we included news links to articles about the expectation for amendments of the Xylella emergency measures. Just to complete my part, a little conclusion. The media monitor is important for to inform farmers, citizens, risk assessor, and risk manager, and also it can help. It can inform decision makers on the impact of their measures. So Jens, I give the floor to Jens for the rest of the presentation. Okay.
Thank you, Maria. I'm going to show you which systems are publicly available and how you can profit from that. I start with a screenshot of the Medisys website that is publicly available. And we have one dedicated site on Xylella fastidiosa, and here in the upper area, in the gray area, you can see that we run also Twitter analysis on the 1% sample. So we screen roughly 5.56 million tweets a day. That was taken Monday at 11:44. So you can see that the top URL is actually about the EFSA event. So people are tweeting about that, and top hashtag is Xylella17. So there's a bit a feedback loop that we are creating. On Monday, there were two articles about Corsica. So we show two French articles about Xylella fastidiosa. And when you go to the website, and I will show you that later on the live system, you can actually subscribe to the email alert and to the RSS. So on the next slide, I just want to show two graphs that we show on the website. So first of all, you have a time window of 30 days to just see what, a histogram, how many articles you get per day. And the last 30 days, it was not particularly high volume. We got up to 40 articles a day. And we extract the countries that are mostly mentioned in the text. So here you can see that Italy, Spain are mentioned quite often, and France is mentioned. On top of that, we also created an application which we called Big Screen Map. This is also publicly available, and it was shown during the poster session. And here we just cycle through the latest publications like a news ticker. So here I chose 4 diseases, Xylella fastidiosa and 3 other plant pests. And we show only English, French, Italian, and Spanish in this view. That can be customized. So what I picked up was an article from Diario de Mallorca about Xylella and how the insect propagates in Mallorca. And when you look at the live system, you also see that there are some articles about our conference appearing in the media. So the question is, which service do we provide and how you can profit from it? So I would like to invite you to go to the website and have a look at the Xylella fastidiosa monitoring. As Maria mentioned, we have extracted more than 3,000 articles now in this year, only from 1st of March until this week. Many users choose not to go to the website. They go there only once to subscribe to a daily email alert. So many users set the alert to get a daily update at 8 o'clock in the morning. So when you come in the office, you see what has been published on Xylella fastidiosa. And I think this is useful because probably all of you, we are all reading what is published in your favorite newspapers and so on. And here you can do that in a more systematic approach. The big screen map is not interactive. It's mostly meant for emergency operating centers. So over the last 10 years, we've been working with human health. So we've been working on measles, Ebola, coronavirus, avian flu, swine flu, and so on for WHO, so for the World Health Organization, and for the European Centre for Disease Control in Stockholm. So basically, we are now applying the same methods to plant health. On top of that, we are also open for any new suggestions. If you have a favorite plant pest or vector that you would like to monitor, and you think that there's something being published on the internet, we can also help you to set up monitoring for specific threats or for events. I mean, we have been working with communications, also with communications at EFSA. So it's possible to see what is being published on your organization or on your event, on your press release, and so on. And with that, I would like to jump now to the live system, just to have a quick look what is being published today. So these are the automatically produced results, and there are obviously also some irrelevant news or some articles where we got something wrong in the algorithm. If you want a human moderated newsletter, then you would have to go to a product like the newsletter that is published by EFSA. So, but this is now giving you basically a snapshot of what is happening today. So there are some articles in Italian and Spanish about. Sorry. Okay, thank you. So there are some articles published in Italian and in Spanish about Xylella fastidiosa. Again, you can see the map, you can see the graphs. We also extract some quotes, so we extract what are the most important quotes about Xylella. So here are the statistics. And on top, you can also see the top URL. So this is what is being talked about on Twitter. So the first link is from this journal. I just click on it. Should open the original article. Yeah, so this is actually about our conference, yeah. Was published yesterday. So this is what we found from Twitter, and the top hashtags are Xylella 17. The second application that I mentioned was the big screen map, and if you have an emergency operations center or big screen in your lab, you can link to this site. And here we just project on a map what has been published on Xylella and 3 other diseases in a subset of languages. And we show you also the past events. You can see that there have been many articles that were geolocated, for example, to Apulia, obviously. And here we are going through the latest results, the 10 articles that we found on the internet in these languages. There's also a news ticker above. It's CNN style, where you can see the latest results. So basically, there's no interactivity on the map. You show it on your monitor in the lab, and once the algorithm goes through all the latest articles, at the end it will reload the latest news and start again from the top. So I want to show you quickly how you can profit from the email alert that was mentioned 2 times already. So you just need to go to this website once, and you click on subscribe, leave your email address, and our server will send you a link where you can specify at which time of the day you would like to receive the update and which languages you would like to choose. Alternatively, you can also use an RSS feed. You can bind that into your Outlook. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, we'll come to that later. And as I said earlier, we are open also to suggestions for new plant pests or vectors. We can extend our monitoring, and very open to sharing our system. Likewise, we can also share the results of our monitoring with you. So if you are interested, let's say, in the 3,000 articles that we extracted since March this year, we can also share that. In there, you have all the metadata. You can see, for example, which countries were mentioned, which geolocations we found, and so on. That might be useful for some of you. Then you could also map that on your map with other data. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And we go now to the last talk of this session. It's by Claudio Bogliotti of the Mediterranean Agronomic Institute of Bari. And he's talking about stakeholder perception of Xylella fastidiosa in Apulia.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, everybody. Well, I just realized that I'm the last of a long sequence of scientific speaking. But I take this as a positive sign. I take this as a positive sign from the scientific community to open the debate also on topics which are not necessarily addressed to our common friend Xylella, or the vectors, or the model. And as also Monique did, I mean, I will not talk about these, but I will talk about the people. Trying also to take home the message that Rodrigo Almeida has given in the first day of trying to be more holistic. Well, this is a contribution. It's a contribution in progress, and see whether, I mean, and how we, through the work we can do with the people or addressing the people, we can also contribute to have a more holistic approach. Well, what is the rationale behind? Well, the rationale is that, as you know, as also it has been said by my predecessor, the second last, there are several cross-cutting factors which are affecting the success or the good implementation of containment strategies on Xylella fastidiosa disease. These are, for example, the stakeholder knowledge, the stakeholder perception of the disease and related socio-economic impacts. Also, the effective governance. The governance is made of the people. It's not only made of the institution per se. It's made of the people. And the governance of the information and the flow of the information and the decision-making process. In spite of all of this, in spite we know this, there are still quite limited study or quite limited attempts when we look at the problem of Xylella to this kind of problems to the people. What is the objective of the analysis? Actually, this is a work in progress. We started a few months ago in the frame of the XF factors. This is a little part of a more comprehensive work, which is dealing with the socioeconomic and environmental impact assessment and risk assessment. But we started with the stakeholder analysis. Actually, the analysis is really in progress, and this is the presentation of very preliminary results and not all the interviews that were planned to be carried out. What we did, we collect the point of view and perception of the people about the disease, about the containment plans. We identify possible gaps in communication. We understand also the network of relationships existing among the stakeholders in the territory. We collect suggestions from the local people that can help improving also the management of the information and the communication. We did that in Puglia. We did that in Kenya as well, with our colleagues of CIHEAM in Kenya. And these two areas are just part of a list of case studies which are foreseen to be implemented in the exact factors project. Behind these two cases, we will gonna work, and it is imminent to start. I mean, working in Spain, thanks to our friends and colleagues from Spain, and also very imminent to start in Costa Rica and Brazil. First of all, we to identify also, where to work. We have a case study structure, which is made up of pilot areas, and we work in the infected area, but also we work in the not infected area. In the infected area, just to assess the perception of the level of risk to which people and the territory, the system, are exposed. And describe and estimate, the impacts of the measures which have been applied to the intervention which are assumed to be taken on. But in not infected area, it's also important to work because these people are not affected yet, but they have a feeling, or they might have a feeling, and we think they have a feeling, but there's also, it has been said before, these feelings are not linear processes, and they don't think like we think. They think in another way. So to collect information about the disease and assess their perception too. So, as I said, we work in Puglia, and in Puglia we worked in the infected area and also in the non-infected area, although there are also the other two areas, the containment area and the buffer zone, in which we were going to work, but we did not have time yet to also carry out the contacts and the interviews with the stakeholders. In the infected area, we just worked on 3 pilot areas linked to the municipalities of Gallipoli, L'Aquila, and Trepuzzi, and in the not infected area, Monopoli, Bitonto, Andria, and Corato. And in Cania, we worked in the 3 municipalities which are in the north of the islands and in non-infected area so far, or 3. How we did the stakeholder identification? Well, we tried to follow an approach of snowball rolling, identifying one of them, at least in the beginning, that could be the first to answer a questionnaire, and from the first, try to get also the contact from the first of the other stakeholder, at least other 2 stakeholders, and then, in a ramification, go further. This kind of identification will certainly allow also to understand a bit more on the relationships there are amongst the different people, among the different stakeholders, and also how they communicate. We carried out up to now 90 surveys, 90 interviews. This is the range of the age of the people, but mostly between around the 20, 22, 23. Between the 40 and the 60 years old. Mainly secondary school education. They are mainly farmers, but not only farmers, because there are also in the respondents people which are advising, for example, the municipalities or working within the municipalities. So therefore, they are more involved in the governance system, assumably. And the average surface of the plot is rather low anyway, and this is not giving a big critical mass to the people because they are owner of not really big plots. And of course, they are all having a very sensitive crop, which is the olive tree in their ownership. The questionnaire is quite comprehensive, quite complex, and that's why it takes really a long time to carry it out. Apart from A and B, which are very general questions, we have also included questions on the knowledge they have about symptoms, for example, and effectiveness and the transmission mode, the perception of the treat, the impacts from the disease. I don't go into detail because we have no time, but as you see, it's quite comprehensive in order to try to really understand what is their more ample range of perceptions and knowledge of what's going on. Then we group and we cluster the questions within two domains, which is the risk domain and the governance domain, and the risk domain having three dimensions: the knowledge dimension, the perception dimension, the practices, the farm practices, and each of them, okay, being expressed after the survey through disease knowledge index, disease perception index, and farm practice index. The same we did for the governance, three dimension, the involvement, the effectiveness, and the responsibility. A bit of glossary. For the knowledge index, we mean the level of knowledge about the Xylella fastidiosa disease in relation to pathogen, spreading, symptoms, and host plant. Perception is a risk perception and the risk vulnerability. Practice is the good appreciation of whether there is an appreciation and acceptance of prevention, containment, of mitigation measures. And from the governance side, the involvement as an involvement of the respondent, of the people, and see whether they feel involved, whether they are involved actually in the different activities vis-à-vis the vigilance, the information, the extension, the response, the post-crisis action. Effectiveness, for effectiveness we mean the evaluation by the respondents of the effectiveness in the stakeholder in their involvement, as well as their trust in the public authorities, and responsibility and knowledge of the different level of responsibility. Well, I don't want to go into the detail of the scoring, okay, but simply say, we just have, a simple scoring between +1 and -1, including 0, okay, and depending on the question, okay, we just normalize the scoring, okay, statistically. I would prefer to give directly to the outcomes. And let's see the outcomes in the domain of the risk, see the preliminary result. When we talk about the knowledge index, well, the knowledge index, it is rather high in Puglia, in the affected area. Of course, more higher than in the non-infected area and in Kenya. But the perception risk is generally very low. There is a very low perception in all the different areas, although, a little bit higher in the infected area, but, when you look at the non-infected area in Puglia, although the non-infected area is just very nearby the infected area, the perception, okay, of the risk is low. It is even lower than in the non-infected area in Kenya, in Greece, which are maybe even more far away than the infected area of Puglia. The farm practice index, of course, there is a quite high score there for the infected area, higher than in the non-infected, and there is more farm acceptance, okay, what we see from the outcomes, more farm acceptance than real implementation. The farmers say, yeah, I accept, I can do it, we can do it. But at the end, the implementation is very low. And the plot area of the risk domain is very high, of course, as you can imagine, in the infected area, and decreases in the non-infected areas. In relation to the governance, well, the governance, the involvement. Well, the involvement in the non-infected area is rather interesting, okay, and also in the non-infected area in Crete, and more than in the infected area. The effectiveness, reach the lower level, okay, in the infected area in Puglia. And the responsibility, there is a low level of responsibility about the roles in the management of this disease for all the pilot areas. And this is the result of the plot area, the governance domain. The correlations, we did also an analysis of the data in order to check the correlation. There is a positive correlation among the indexed. And this correlation, as you see, they can give us also some inputs for the future in order to just go and see where we can maybe insist more in doing things and in suggesting things to them, or not, or maybe sharing with them. In the infected pilot area, we see that there is a very high score of risk domain. But this is obtained in spite of the lower level of governance. The people, and particularly the farmers and all the holders, they, in spite of the low level of governance, they try to increase and to be prepared anyway. But the problem is that, they prepare themselves and they build their knowledge, on themselves, without really being contaminated by the external inputs of the system of governance. So after 2 years, or 2-3 years, they build their own knowledge. It's going to be difficult then, even if you set down a good and efficient governance system, to change their mind. And as you see, a shared and clear decision-making process is missing. In the non-infected area, the score of the risk domain is lower. The potential role of governance can be very important to design intervention strategies, able to prevent local people concerns. We have to work in non-infected areas. It may be late to work in the infected, but it's not late to work in the non-infected area due to what we have seen. The next steps, because this is our work in progress, and I finish, well, certainly in Puglia, on the suggestion of the stakeholders, we are going to establish a focus group. It's a community of practice. It's built on the respondent, because some of them, they are really willing to be part of a discussion. If it is not part of a governmental governance or system, at least part with the other people of a group. Within the focus group, addressing specific lack of knowledge, build a common vision to reduce the conflict, and communicate with the institution and the local government. And at the regional scale, one of the problems is that we have now to work in order to upscale the work we've done and taking into account other case studies in other regions to increase also the representativeness of this survey. I want to thank my colleagues, which are also mentioned here in the slide, because I'm being talking under their control after all. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. The floor is now open for questions from the audience. Who wants to ask the first question? Yeah, there is a hand in the very back of the room.
Thank you. So I have a couple of comments and one question. So first is a comment to the group on the left of the table. I'm not qualified, but I just wish there were more of you. The group on the right of the table. So first, there are some things in terms of some of the data that you don't have that may be really hard to get, that you for human pathogens, people have done a lot of population genomics, and you can get data on spread, distances, so you can, what Peter was talking about, how far the insects can move and others as well, or the pathogen is moving in the landscape. And it's reasonably cheap and easy to do, considering the amount of money and effort that's going into Xylella in Europe, especially in outbreak areas. So just throw it out there. There's something to consider as something else that could be used for surveillance purposes and some of the work you're doing. The second is, or the question is, for all of you, it's related to latency and incubation periods, which can be quite variable for Xylella. So your each system, essentially, each area is going to be very different. So extrapolating, has all sorts of problems. The other thing is that latency and incubation period are going to have effects on vector behavior. So vectors of Xylella, as far as we know, the system is studied. You have discrimination against symptomatic plants. Essentially, the hotter the plants are for pathogen acquisition, the less the insects actually feed on those plants. I'm wondering if you guys incorporating that. The other thing...
So, can you keep it short, please? So what's the question?
Well, the question is, it's a comment, and so the other thing is also related to vector numbers, and they're also speed or incubation and latency periods. So the question is, ideally you would determine that experimentally, and if you can't, which you may not be able to, how are you thinking of approaching that and incorporating all those different parameters, which we know already are relevant?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not sure who wants to answer this. Stephen has courage.
Okay, so we are trying to incorporate some of those dynamics. Like you say, the issue is how you parameterize such interactions. So another little modeling secret, we can model anything, but how useful is that going to be? So, for example, we talked about vector dynamics. It was in my talk, and it was in Peter's talk and Alex's talk about how things spread in space. The key is how you actually get a functional response out of the data that we have. We know because of for example, Peter had a nice simulation where he showed where all the infections occurred over time in space, right? So it's that lovely map showing how the infections, the locations of the infections were in the south of the peninsula, and they moved up. And he also showed where the negatives were. And those negatives correspond to where all the samplings occurred. However, there's a lot of bias in that. So, I mean, by that I mean statistical bias, right? So that it's not random sampling all over the peninsula. There's a lot of sampling along the buffer zone because that's what the buffer zone is supposed to be. But then trying to interpret that statistically and mathematically becomes problematic. So interpreting how we model dispersal becomes quite challenging. Other things, like you say, lag, so asymptotic lags are also difficult to estimate. And I know people are trying to work on that, but it takes time to do that. So we're hoping through X Factors and Ponti that this information will become available, and then we'll incorporate that information into the model in a mechanistic way. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, maybe move on to a different question. It's not immediately coming. I have a question. So especially, well, actually most of these talks have a bearing on management. So they're meant to inform how you would manage the disease, what are optimal strategies. So are you getting any feedback on how useful the results are and how they affect management? Are you getting questions whether you can do different things? Are you talking to managers at all, or otherwise we can ask managers who are in the room to respond?
Okay. So, short answer, yes. The other short answer is no. One shorter than the other. I think we'd love to have a conversation with managers. I'd like to, personally, I'd like to see the data where the control is happening, make that data available. I think we can do a better job assessing how well our models are doing in predictions. At the moment, we're at the stage of saying what-if type scenarios, but I think over the course of the rest of the project, we'll be able to see a lot more information occurring and a lot more integration between models and what's going on in the country.
Mm-hmm. Maybe some response from the floor on this point? No. I would like to get some. Is it related to this point or not related? Not related. Anybody wants to respond on the connection between management and modeling and scenarios and media monitoring? These guys are craving for feedback.
It seems to me these models, scaling is quite critical. My impression is that the scale we're dealing with is on kilometers, with an upper limit of 40 or 50 kilometers. How do the models cope with very short distance spread, number one, by, within, say, a 10 orchard space? And on the other extreme, how do they deal with long distance spread by accident, where you have a lag period of maybe 5 years before people realize what's hitting them?
Okay, I guess it's me again.
You all get a turn, I think.
Yeah, please. So at the moment, when we're talking about within orchard stuff, we treat that as a single model. We don't really look within orchards spread explicitly, although we have developed models that are not published yet on how that might occur. The problem again is data and sort of tying together meaningful models with data, and that's something we're working on in collaboration with Juan Navas, where he's looking at these sort of severity plots where they're monitoring each individual tree over time. And so our idea in the future is to look at that. In terms of further long-distance spread, so we have a component in the model which is sort of more sort of human dispersal, perhaps by vectors hitchhiking on cars. So we built that into our model. But when we're talking about sort of this lag of, say, 5 years, we're not really thinking of that at the moment. But I think that's really an interesting point that we should address in the future.
Yeah, I think you both bring up some key questions that are very challenging, but are also at the core of maybe the distance between the left and the right side of the table, and which is probably one of the key challenges thinking about this entire project, because we can model all we want, but what are we going to do with it, or what is anybody going to do with it, right? And I don't know. I think on the modeling side, the computing capacity is allowing us to challenge models across scales in a much better way than we were able to do only when I started grad school. So I think there we do have an opportunity to work across scales. To give you an example, the data that Pablo showed yesterday on, and also Juan showed on mapping severity in individual trees across what maybe a single farmer would own, we are capable of challenging similar models that have been developed across larger scale only because that is the training data we have at such scales. We're not there yet to implement that, but that's technically feasible. And maybe that is an opportunity then to bring the science to the people who are actually on the ground, which is what we need to do.
Yeah, I have no more.
Okay. There are no further comments here. There's somebody who really wants to ask something.
Regarding modeling, I'm still curious to know how you make these models even we don't have data regarding the southern part of the peninsula. This is the first part. And how much data you insert about the insect vector population and fluctuation, and how much of this insect have been infected or not. So I know that we have few data in this sense. And what do you think? to make a model, a very effective model, we need to have a lot of data about the percentage and the fluctuation of this population and how much of them in each area?
Sorry, it's me again. So I think, so I'd like more data. I'd like, if I have a wish list, I would like highly temporal data on vector seasonality, what you're catching, where you're catching it, and like you say, what's infected, what sort of ratios of what's infected. I'd also like to have it in sort of different locations, because I think from all the posters and talks I've seen in terms of vector biology and ecology, it seems to be that it's quite different. So, for example, in Domenico's group, they were talking about they had the two regions, so there's Piedmont and Apulia, and they showed quite different seasonal dynamics. And so what I did when I had a little play with that and put those sorts of dynamics into the model and show you can get sort of quite different behaviors in terms of the infection. So I think if we can try to understand how we go from vector biology and ecology through to transmission and how that then relates into environment, whether that's temporally or spatially, I think we can get a long way into predicting how the epidemics are progressing.
I think part of the modeling challenge or essence in applied science is to dare say what is meaningful but not important. And in this room we have competence about the full range of the system, but I think we also need to dare point out the things that are already obvious without the model, the project being born to completion, which will be in 3 years. No? So I think from the modeler side, part of the exercise is also saying which are the areas we really need to focus on among that wish list, which is beautifully long and scientifically gorgeous, but we also need to, within our rigorous modeling framework, say which are the ones that really cause the behavior of the model to go one way or the other, and which ones actually don't matter so much. And I think we're at a stage now, we're looking back at the epidemics we've seen, that maybe we're better informed to, and we're better able to justify that.
Can I just add to that? I think, sorry, just 1 second. So one of the themes that has come out from at least this side of the table's talks is that long distance dispersal seems to be a key driver of our efficacy to prevent the spread of disease. So I think that, for me at least, that's probably one of the biggest things we need to try to understand.
I think we are also speaking here about awareness and involving non-scientists in the problem, like farmers and let's say average people. And to me, social media and smartphone applications are really underexplored. If you look for Facebook, Xylella, there's a site, the last entry is April 2016. I do not think that people go to an EU website to get information. They rather go to these social media, and I think there's really a lack of things that need to be developed.
Okay, we can have one last question, and then we need to go for a group photo. Yeah.
I have an invitation for someone in the table. We at Mallorca, we have an outbreak, and we know that it began in 2003. We have a lot of information that has not been looked for. I mean, in the wood, we can detect the DNA of Xylella. We are now doing eradication measures, and we are felling a lot of trees, and we have the trunks. We're going to try to extract this information, try to look on the growing rings, and maybe if we can find some relationship between the radial movement of the bacteria maybe we can date how it began and how it progressed. So I would like to invite publicly to someone from the table who had done a very, very good work. Maybe we can model and reconstruct one of the most important diseases happening here in Europe. First, and probably has been the first one. This is all what I want to say.
Okay. Yeah.
We'd love to take up the challenge. The people in front of you, the row right in front of you and the 2 rows in front of you would love to talk to you, and they will do that.
Yeah, I think there's a very nice invitation there. So I think we have to close the session. I think there's a lot of things that maybe people are very interested to ask, but don't dare to ask in public. So I invite you to use the coffee break for asking all those difficult questions. And please join the group photo, and thanks to the speakers.